He invited her to be humiliated, but he forgot she could choose how to arrive. The chapel glowed in soft gold light, a curated dream of perfection where every chair was aligned, every flower arranged with obsessive precision, and at the center of it all stood Jason Reed, tall, composed, every inch the man who believed he had already won, his hand resting lightly over Chloe Bennett's as guests whispered admiration behind polished smiles, the air thick with perfume, champagne, and quiet judgment, and yet beneath the surface, something sharper lingered, something expectant. Because the real show hadn't started yet, it was written into the invitation he had sent weeks ago, her name printed deliberately, carefully, like a final insult disguised as courtesy, Emily Carter, his ex-wife, the woman he had erased, the woman he had reduced to a cautionary story told in hushed tones between mutual friends who no longer knew where she had gone or why she had disappeared so completely. And now those same voices circled the room again, curious, almost hungry, glancing toward the entrance as minutes stretched. "She's not coming," someone murmured, a quiet laugh following. "Why would she?" another replied. "After everything." And Jason heard them. Of course he did, the faint curl of satisfaction touching his lips before he masked it behind a gracious smile, because this was the narrative he had built, controlled, perfected, the story where he moved forward and she faded into nothing, where tonight would seal it publicly, beautifully, undeniably, and yet the longer the doors remained closed, the more the silence began to shift, subtle at first, like a change in temperature, like a breath held too long. Chloe leaned closer to him, her voice light but edged with something curious. Maybe she realized she couldn't handle it, and Jason nodded slightly, though something flickered behind his eyes, not doubt, not yet, but awareness, because Emily had never been predictable, not really, not even when he thought he had her figured out. The music continued, the officiant adjusted his notes, a glass clinked somewhere in the back, and then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough, the faint sound of tires outside on gravel, distant but unmistakable. A ripple moved through the room, heads turning instinctively, conversations faltering mid-sentence, and for the first time that night, Jason's posture shifted, just slightly, his fingers tightening against Chloe's hand. As the sound grew clearer, closer, and something in the air changed, something that didn't belong to him anymore, because whatever was about to step through those doors wasn't part of the story he had written. The sound outside did not belong to the ceremony, and yet it pulled every eye toward the tall wooden doors as if something unseen had just taken control of the room, and in that suspended moment, time stretched, thin and fragile, while Jason stood there with a smile that no longer quite fit his face, because beneath the polished surface of his confidence, something old had begun to stir, something he had buried the day he walked away from Emily Carter, as if she had been nothing more than a chapter he could simply close. But memory does not close, it lingers, it waits, and now it returned in fragments he could not stop, a quiet apartment filled with unpacked boxes. Her standing near the window with sunlight catching in her hair as she spoke softly about starting over, about building something small but real, something that did not need to impress anyone, and he had laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, but dismissively, the kind of laugh that reduces a dream into something childish, something unworthy, because at that time he believed success meant speed, meant power, meant leaving behind anything that did not elevate his image, and Emily had not fit into that vision anymore, not with her quiet strength, not with the way she asked for presence instead of performance. And so he had rewritten her in his mind as the one who could not keep up, the one who chose to disappear, the one who simply was not enough, and the world had accepted that version easily, because it was convenient, because it was clean, because it required no questions. And now those same people stood in this room, dressed in tailored suits and shimmering dresses, whispering the same assumptions, their voices low but sharp. She could not handle the pressure. She was never really part of his world. Some people are just not built for this. And Chloe, standing beside him in a flawless white gown, absorbed those whispers like validation, her posture straight, her chin slightly lifted, her presence designed to contrast everything Emily had been labeled as, and yet even she felt it, that shift in the air. That subtle unease that no one could name, because the sound outside had not faded, it had grown closer, more deliberate, and then there was silence, complete and absolute, the kind that presses against your chest and makes you aware of your own breathing, and in that silence, Jason's mind betrayed him again, not with regret, not yet, but with a question he had never allowed himself to ask. What if she had not disappeared because she was weak? What if she had left because she had finally seen him clearly, the man who measured love in status, who replaced loyalty with ambition, who believed that control was the same as strength, and the thought unsettled him in a way he could not explain, because it shifted the foundation of everything he had built since, and just as he tried to steady himself, to reclaim the narrative, the doors at the far end of the chapel trembled slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw every gaze forward again, and this time, no one spoke, because something was about to enter that did not belong to the past he had rewritten, something that carried a truth he had never prepared to face, and somewhere deep inside, before the doors even opened, Jason knew, whatever stood on the other side was not here to play the role he had assigned to it. The doors opened without urgency, almost gently, as if whatever stood beyond them had no need to rush, and the first thing the room noticed was not her. Not yet, but the children, 3 small figures stepping forward in perfect, unspoken sync, their polished shoes tapping softly against the marble floor, their presence so unexpected that it fractured the silence into something fragile and uncertain, whispers rising but never quite forming words, because they looked alike in a way that demanded attention, the same height, the same composed stillness, the same unmistakable features that made people glance instinctively toward Jason without understanding why, and then she appeared behind them, not stepping forward quickly, not announcing herself, simply arriving, and the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, like a change in gravity that everyone felt but no one could control. Emily Carter moved with a calm that did not ask for permission, her black dress simple yet precise, her posture steady, her gaze level, and for a moment it was not what she wore or how she looked that held the room, it was the absence of hesitation, the complete lack of need to prove anything, and Jason felt it before he understood it, his chest tightening as recognition collided with something far more unsettling, the realization that she had not come back as someone seeking closure, she had come back as someone who no longer needed it. Chloe's fingers tightened around his arm, her smile frozen in place as her eyes moved between the children and Emily, trying to piece together a narrative that no longer made sense, because this was not part of the story they had prepared for, not the broken ex-wife, not the quiet embarrassment, but something else entirely, something composed, deliberate, undeniable, and the children stopped just a few feet inside the room, their presence anchoring the moment, their eyes moving with quiet curiosity, not fear, not confusion, simply awareness, as if they understood more than anyone expected, and then Emily stepped forward, just one step, enough to stand fully in the light, and Jason saw it clearly now, not just her, but them, the alignment of timelines he had never bothered to consider, the echo of himself reflected in 3 small faces, subtle but undeniable, and the room felt it too, that unspoken connection rippling outward, breaking apart every assumption that had been whispered just minutes ago, and no one laughed now, no one leaned into gossip, because the narrative had shifted beyond their control, and Jason opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps to regain something of what he had lost, but no words came, because there was nothing he could say that would fit this moment, nothing that would restore the version of reality he had so carefully constructed, and Emily did not rush to fill the silence, she did not explain, did not accuse, did not even look angry. She simply held his gaze with a quiet steadiness that carried more weight than any accusation ever could, and in that stillness, everything he had built began to feel fragile, temporary, incomplete, because the truth had not arrived with noise, it had arrived with presence, with 3 small footsteps and a woman who no longer belonged to his version of the past, and as the silence stretched, deeper now, heavier, the entire room seemed to lean toward her without realizing it, drawn not by spectacle, but by certainty, because whatever she was about to reveal next would not just change the night, it would redefine everything they thought they knew. No one moved, not even the officiant, whose script now hung uselessly in his trembling hands as the moment slipped entirely out of ceremony and into something far more real, something no one had rehearsed, and Emily could feel it, the shift of attention, the quiet gravity pulling every gaze toward her, but she did not rush to speak, because she had learned something in the years she had spent rebuilding her life piece by piece, that silence, when held with certainty, can be louder than any defense, louder than any explanation, and Jason stood there facing her, the distance between them no more than a few feet yet filled with years of assumptions collapsing all at once, his mind racing through fragments he could not organize. The last conversation they had, the way she had stood in that empty apartment with one hand resting lightly against her side as if guarding something he had not cared to notice, the way she had looked at him not with anger but with a quiet finality that he had mistaken for defeat, and now that memory twisted into something else entirely, something undeniable, because the children standing before him were not questions, they were answers, and the room felt it. That silent confirmation spreading without a single word spoken. Chloe's breath caught as she subtly stepped back, not enough to draw attention, but enough to create space between herself and the unraveling truth beside her, her earlier confidence dissolving into something uncertain, something fragile, because this was no longer about appearances, no longer about a perfect wedding or a carefully curated image. It was about something deeper, something that could not be controlled or dismissed, and Emily finally moved again. Not toward the altar, not toward Jason, but toward the children, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of the one closest to her, a small, grounding gesture that carried more meaning than any declaration, and in that moment the contrast became impossible to ignore, the quiet strength she held now against the version of her everyone had believed, the woman they thought had disappeared, reduced, erased, and yet here she stood, not asking to be acknowledged, not demanding recognition, simply existing in a way that made denial impossible, and Jason felt the weight of it pressing in, the realization that everything he had built this day to prove had been undone without effort, without confrontation, undone by presence alone, his voice finally breaking through, low, uncertain, Emily, but even as he said her name it felt unfamiliar, like something he no longer had the right to claim. And she met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, almost distant, not cold, not bitter, simply resolved, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, carrying across the room without force. "I did not come here to interrupt your day," and the simplicity of the sentence landed heavier than accusation ever could, because it reframed everything. This was not her seeking attention, not her reclaiming anything from him, this was something else, something he had not prepared for, and she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I came because there are things you chose not to see," and the words settled into the silence, quiet but irreversible, and around them the room held its breath again, because whatever came next would not just explain the past, it would expose it, and Jason felt it, the last fragile thread of control slipping from his grasp as he realized that for the first time, he was no longer the one deciding how the story would be told. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and deliberate, threading through the silence until even the smallest movement in the room felt out of place, and Jason stood there with his breath caught somewhere between denial and understanding, because there was no longer any space to pretend this was something minor, something explainable, something he could smooth over with charm or authority, and yet instinct pushed him forward, one step, then another, as if proximity might give him back control, as if standing closer could somehow rewrite what he was seeing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt, but beneath it there was a fracture, subtle but real, and Emily did not flinch, did not retreat. She simply held his gaze as if she had been waiting for that question for years, not because she needed him to ask it, but because he finally had, and the children remained still beside her, not confused, not afraid, just quietly present, their existence speaking louder than anything else in the room, and for the first time Jason truly looked at them, not as a distraction, not as a complication, but as something undeniable, something that carried pieces of him he had never claimed, and the realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, painfully, like a truth forcing its way through layers of avoidance. "No," he murmured, barely audible, as if saying it softly might make it less real, but Emily did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch again, because this was not about convincing him, it was about allowing him to see, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded. "You chose not to ask questions back then," she said, not accusing, simply stating, "You decided what my silence meant without ever listening to it," and the words settled deeper than any anger could have, because they carried a quiet clarity that left no room for argument, and Jason's mind raced backward, searching for moments he had dismissed, conversations he had cut short, signs he had ignored because they did not fit the version of reality he preferred, and each memory now returned sharper, heavier, until the space around him felt unfamiliar, unstable, as if the foundation of his certainty had shifted beneath his feet. Chloe stepped back again, further this time, her expression no longer composed but uncertain, her place beside him no longer as secure as it had seemed minutes ago, because this was not a story she could control either, not one she could smile through, and the guests, once eager spectators, now stood in quiet stillness, their earlier judgments dissolving into something closer to discomfort, because they could feel it too, the weight of what was unfolding, the quiet dismantling of assumptions they had accepted without question. And Jason looked at Emily again, really looked at her, seeing not the woman he had left behind, but someone entirely Different, someone who had endured without asking for recognition, someone who had built something real without needing him to witness it, and that realization landed harder than anything else, because it meant she had not needed him to become who she was now, and for the first time, the imbalance he had once relied on no longer existed. Why now? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it, and Emily's expression softened, not with pity, not with regret, but with something quieter, something resolved, because today, she said gently, you wanted the world to believe a version of the truth that leaves out everything that mattered, and she paused, her hand resting again on the child beside her, grounding herself in the present, and I am not here to take anything from you, she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. I am here so that what exists is not erased. And the words lingered, simple yet immovable, and in that moment, Jason understood something he had never considered before, that this was not about revenge, not about humiliation, but about something far more powerful, something he could not control, because the truth did not need permission to exist, and standing there, surrounded by everything he had built to prove his success, he felt it slipping, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable presence of a life he had chosen to ignore. And as the silence deepened once more, it became clear to everyone in the room that whatever happened next would not restore the illusion that had existed before, because that illusion had already begun to disappear. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the polished floor and gilded walls until even the soft hum of the air system felt too loud, and in that stillness, Emily felt something she had not allowed herself to feel for a long time, not fear, not anger, but clarity, the kind that comes only after everything has already been lost and rebuilt, and she could see it now in the faces around her, the shift from judgment to uncertainty, from confidence to quiet realization, because the story they had all believed was unraveling without resistance, without spectacle, simply by existing in its full form, and Jason stood at the center of it, no longer the architect of the moment but a man trying to understand how it had slipped beyond his control, his eyes moving again to the children, searching for something familiar, something grounding, and finding it in small details he could not deny, the angle of a chin, the shape of a brow, the way one of them tilted their head slightly as if observing everything with careful thought, and it unsettled him more than anything Emily had said, because it was not something he could argue against, not something he could dismiss as interpretation, it was fact, quiet and undeniable, and he swallowed, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence he had worn like armor. Why did you not tell me? And the question lingered, heavy with the assumption that he had been entitled to know, that he had somehow been excluded from something that was his right, and Emily heard it, of course she did, but she did not react immediately, because she understood now that not every question deserved an instant answer, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained even, measured. I tried, she said simply, and those two words carried years within them, years he had not witnessed, had not cared to notice, but you had already decided what my voice meant before I finished speaking, she continued, her gaze steady, not harsh, just honest, and Jason felt that truth land harder than anything else, because somewhere beneath the layers of denial, he remembered, not clearly, not comfortably, but enough, the conversations he had ended too soon, the moments he had brushed aside because they did not align with his timeline, his ambition, his version of progress, and now those moments returned not as distant memories but as consequences standing directly in front of him, and Chloe shifted again, her presence now almost uncertain, her role in this moment no longer defined, because this was not something she could navigate with charm or poise. This was not a social misstep or an awkward interruption, this was something deeper, something that redefined the entire space, and the guests, once eager observers, now stood quietly, no longer whispering, no longer speculating, because there was nothing left to interpret, the truth had already taken shape, and Emily glanced down briefly at the children, her expression softening for just a moment, a quiet reassurance passing between them without words, and when she looked back up, there was no hesitation left, no weight of the past holding her in place, only presence, only purpose, and Jason saw it, the difference, the absence of anything he could influence, and it unsettled him in a way he could not control, because for the first time, he was not the one being observed for his success, his status, his carefully constructed image, he was being seen in contrast to something real, something grounded. Something that did not need approval to exist, and that realization pressed in around him, tightening the space he once commanded so easily, and Emily took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the moment, because she understood that what came next would not be about explanation, it would be about acknowledgement, and the room seemed to sense it too, leaning into the quiet, waiting without knowing exactly for what. Only that it mattered, and Jason stood there, no longer certain of anything except one undeniable truth, that whatever she revealed next would not be something he could undo. The air in the room shifted again, not with movement, but with understanding slowly taking shape in the minds of everyone watching, and Emily could feel it, that fragile moment when truth begins to settle into places where illusion once felt comfortable, and she did not rush it, because she had learned that real things do not need to be forced, they reveal themselves when there is no longer anywhere left to hide, and Jason stood there, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty but held in a tension he could not disguise, his eyes fixed on her as if searching for something that would restore balance, something that would give him back the control he had always relied on, but there was nothing in her expression that offered that, no hesitation, no need for his validation. Only a quiet steadiness that made everything else in the room feel temporary, and the children beside her shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of natural curiosity, their small movements grounding the moment in something real, something human, and Jason noticed it, the way one of them reached gently for Emily's hand without looking, trusting it would be there, and it was, without fail, and that simple connection unsettled him more than anything else, because it showed a life that had existed without him, a life that had grown strong in his absence, and for the first time, the question forming in his mind was not about how to fix this moment, but how much he had never known, how long, he began, but the words faltered, incomplete, because he was not sure what he was asking anymore, and Emily understood, not because she needed clarification, but because she had asked herself the same question in a different way. Years ago, how long she had allowed herself to believe in something that was never truly there, and now the answer stood in front of both of them, undeniable, and she took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the truth she was about to give. "They are 5, she said, her voice calm, even, and the number settled into the room with a quiet finality that rippled outward. 5 years of absence. 5 years of silence that had never truly been empty, and Jason felt it hit him all at once, the timeline collapsing into clarity, the realization that while he had been building his version of success, something else had been growing, something real, something lasting, and he had not been part of it, not even once, and his gaze dropped for a moment, not in defeat, but in something unfamiliar, something closer to understanding, and when he looked back up, there was no easy response waiting for him, no prepared words, only the weight of a truth he had never considered. And Chloe's presence beside him felt distant now, not because she had moved far, but because the space between them had changed, her role no longer defined by admiration but by uncertainty, and the guests, once so certain of what they were witnessing, now stood quietly, no longer judging, no longer whispering, simply watching as something real unfolded in front of them, something that could not be reduced to gossip or spectacle. And Emily remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply holding her place with a calm that did not seek approval, and in that stillness, the balance of the room shifted completely, no longer centered around the ceremony, no longer revolving around Jason, but drawn instead toward something deeper, something grounded in truth rather than performance, and Jason felt it, that shift in focus, that loss of center, and for the first time in a long time, he did not know how to respond, because this was not a situation he could navigate with confidence or control. This was something that required acknowledgement, something that demanded he see beyond himself, and as the silence stretched once more, heavier now, more defined, it became clear that the moment was no longer about what had been revealed, but about what would be faced next, because truth, once seen, does not disappear, it waits, patient and unyielding, for someone to decide what to do with it. The number did not fade, it lingered in the air like a quiet echo that refused to be ignored. 5 years, long enough to build a life, long enough to heal, long enough to become someone entirely different, and Emily could feel the weight of it settling into the room as every person there began to understand that what stood before them was not a sudden revelation, but the result of time, of patience, of choices made in silence, and Jason remained still, his mind no longer racing but slowing in a way that felt unfamiliar, because for the first time he was not trying to solve a problem or regain control, he was trying to understand something that did not revolve around him, and it was disorienting, the realization that while he had been moving forward, celebrating milestones, building connections, she had been living a parallel life just as real, just as full, without him, and the children shifted slightly again, one of them glancing up at Emily with a quiet question in their eyes, not spoken but felt, and she answered it with the smallest nod, a reassurance that everything was as it should be, that they were safe, that they belonged exactly where they stood, and that simple exchange carried a depth that no one in the room could ignore, because it spoke of years of trust, of consistency, of presence. The very things Jason had once dismissed as secondary, and now he could see the cost of that dismissal, not in anger, not in accusation, but in absence, in the space where he should have been and was not, and Chloe finally let go of his arm completely, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with a quiet withdrawal that said more than any reaction could, her expression no longer confident, no longer certain, because the foundation she had stood on moments ago had shifted beyond recognition, and the guests, once so eager to witness a perfect union, now stood as quiet observers of something far more complex, something that could not be summarized in a single moment or explained away with simple conclusions, and Emily remained composed, her presence steady, not demanding attention yet holding it entirely, because she was no longer trying to be seen, she simply was, and that difference changed everything, and Jason felt it pressing in around him, the understanding that this moment was not about reclaiming anything, not about fixing what had been lost, but about acknowledging what had been real all along. And for the first time, he lowered his gaze not out of avoidance, but out of reflection, as if searching within himself for something he had never taken the time to examine, and when he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not resolution, not clarity, but the beginning of awareness, fragile and uncertain, and Emily saw it, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with quiet acceptance, because she did not need him to fully understand in this moment, she only needed the truth to exist without being denied. And the silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer waiting for something to break, it was settled, grounded, as if the room itself had adjusted to a new reality, one that no longer revolved around appearances or assumptions, but around something far more honest, and as that reality took hold, it became clear that what had started as a carefully planned day was no longer under anyone's control, because truth, once present, does not ask permission to stay, it simply does, and standing there, with every eye no longer judging but witnessing, Emily knew that whatever came next would not erase what had been revealed. It would only build upon it, and for the first time since she stepped through those doors, the room felt not like a stage, but like a place where something real had finally been allowed to exist. The room no longer felt like a place meant for celebration, it felt like a space suspended between what had been planned and what was now unfolding, and in that fragile stillness, something shifted again, not in Emily, not in the children, but in the man who had once believed he controlled everything, because Jason Reed, for the first time, was not reacting as the center of attention. He was absorbing, processing, confronting something he had never prepared himself to face, and it showed in the smallest ways, in the way his shoulders no longer held that effortless confidence, in the way his breath came slower, heavier, as if each realization carried weight he could not easily set down, and his gaze moved again to the children, lingering now, not with confusion but with something deeper, something closer to recognition, and one of them met his eyes without hesitation, not with expectation, not with accusation, just curiosity, a simple, unguarded awareness that made the moment even more real, because there was no script for this, no performance to hide behind, just presence, and Jason felt it, that quiet, undeniable connection that did not need words to exist, and it unsettled him in a way nothing else had, because it was not about what he had lost, it was about what had existed without him, fully, completely, undeniably, and he took a step forward, slow, uncertain, as if testing ground that no longer felt stable beneath him, and the room noticed, of course it did, because every movement now carried meaning, every shift in posture felt amplified in the silence that surrounded them, and Chloe remained where she was. But her distance had become unmistakable, no longer standing beside him as part of a shared moment, but slightly apart, her presence now separate, her expression caught between confusion and quiet retreat, as if she too was realizing that this was not a situation she could navigate, not a moment she could reclaim, and Emily watched it all without interference, without reaction, because she was no longer part of that dynamic, she was no longer defined by his choices or her absence within them. She simply existed outside of it now, grounded in something that did not shift with perception, and Jason finally spoke again, his voice lower, stripped of the authority it once carried. "I did not know," he said, and the words hung there, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a realization, incomplete and late, and Emily heard it, but she did not soften, not because she lacked compassion, but because she had moved beyond the need to respond to that kind of statement, because knowing had never been the point. Choosing to see had been, and she answered with quiet clarity, "You did not try to know," and there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just truth, simple and direct, and it landed heavier than anything else she could have said, because it removed the space for misunderstanding, and Jason felt it, the difference between ignorance and avoidance, the recognition that this moment was not the result of something hidden from him, but something he had chosen not to face, and the room absorbed it with him, that subtle but powerful shift, the understanding that what had been revealed was not sudden, not dramatic, but inevitable, and one of the children stepped slightly closer to Emily, their small hand brushing against hers again, and she responded instinctively, her fingers closing gently around it, a quiet, grounding connection that spoke of years of presence, of consistency, of something that had been built slowly and deliberately without the need for acknowledgement, and Jason saw that too, and for the first time, the realization settled fully, not as a shock, but as a truth he could no longer avoid, that whatever he had believed about the past, whatever story he had told himself to move forward, it had never been complete, and now, standing in the middle of a moment that had been designed to celebrate him, he was no longer the one being elevated, he was the one being confronted by something far more powerful than any image he had created, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, it was grounded, steady, as if the room itself had accepted that what mattered now was not what had been planned, but what was real, and as Jason stood there, facing a life he had never known, it became clear that the next step would not belong to him alone, because for the first time, he was not the one deciding how this story would continue. The silence settled into something heavier now, no longer fragile but anchored, as if the truth that had entered the room had taken root and refused to be moved, and Jason stood there feeling it fully for the first time, not as a passing shock but as something permanent, something that would not disappear when the moment ended, and his gaze shifted once more between Emily and the children, slower now, more deliberate, as if he was trying to memorize what he had missed, to understand how something so significant could have existed just outside the edges of his awareness for so long, and the realization did not come with drama, it came quietly, steadily, like a weight settling into place, and he exhaled, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his voice when it came again no longer searching for control, only clarity, what happens now, and the question lingered, simple on the surface but carrying something deeper beneath it, because for the first time, he was not asking how to fix the situation, he was asking how to face it, and Emily heard the difference, she felt it in the shift of his tone, in the absence of assumption, and she did not rush to answer, because this was not a question that required speed. It required honesty, and she looked at him with the same steady gaze she had held from the moment she arrived, not distant, not cold, but grounded, present, and certain, and when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality. Now, you see them, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else, because it removed every layer of complication, every excuse, every deflection, leaving only what mattered, presence, acknowledgement, reality, and Jason absorbed it, not as a demand, not as an accusation, but as something unavoidable, something that could not be negotiated or reshaped, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting it settle, letting the weight of what he had not seen become something he could no longer ignore, and the children remained still, their quiet awareness unchanged, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply existing in a way that made everything else feel secondary, and one of them glanced toward the rows of guests, then back to Emily, as if sensing the shift in the room, and she responded with a small, reassuring smile, a gesture so natural it spoke of years of practice, of countless moments where she had been the one providing stability, the one holding everything together without recognition, and Jason saw that too, the quiet strength that had once seemed invisible to him now impossible to overlook, and it changed something, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough for the edges of his certainty to soften, enough for him to recognize that this moment was not about reclaiming what he had lost, but about acknowledging what had always been real, and Chloe, standing just a step behind him now, watched the exchange with a growing stillness, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something reflective, because she could feel it as well, that the center of this moment no longer belonged to the ceremony, no longer belonged to the image they had built. It belonged to something else entirely, something grounded and unshakable, and the guests, once so certain in their roles as witnesses to a celebration, now stood as observers of something far more meaningful, something that did not require applause or approval, only recognition, and Emily remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her presence unchanged, because she had not come to take anything. She had come to let something exist, and that distinction defined everything, and as the silence settled once more, not heavy now but clear, almost calm, it became evident that the moment had shifted beyond its original purpose entirely, that what had begun as a day meant to confirm a narrative had instead revealed a truth that could not be undone, and standing there, with every assumption stripped away, Jason understood something he had never fully grasped before. That control was never the same as understanding, and that the life he had chosen not to see had not disappeared, it had simply continued without him, growing stronger, more complete, until it no longer needed his recognition to be real, and now, for the first time, he stood not as the author of the story, but as someone finally being asked to read it as it truly was. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed into the open, and in that quiet, something shifted again, not outwardly, not in movement or sound, but internally, within the man who had once believed he defined the moment, because Jason stood there no longer searching for control, no longer reaching for a version of events that would place him back at the center. Instead he stood with something unfamiliar settling into him, something heavier than pride, something steadier than denial, and it showed in the way his posture softened, in the way his gaze no longer scanned for escape but remained fixed on what was real, and the children, still calm, still grounded, seemed to anchor that reality in place, their presence no longer a shock but a quiet certainty, and one of them shifted slightly closer, not to him, but to Emily, reinforcing without words where their world had been built, where their trust had grown, and Jason noticed it, not as rejection, but as truth, and for the first time, he did not resist it, he accepted it, slowly, carefully, as if understanding required patience he had never practiced before, and Emily watched him, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a quiet awareness that this moment was no longer hers to shape, it was his to face, and she had already done what she came to do, she had allowed the truth to exist, and now it would remain, regardless of what followed, and Chloe, standing just behind him, exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the stillness, but it marked something important, a recognition that the story she had stepped into was not as simple as it had seemed, that the man beside her was no longer standing on the same ground he had occupied just minutes before, and she took another small step back, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement, because some moments are not meant to be shared equally, some moments belong to truths that cannot be divided, and the guests, once distant observers, now held a different kind of attention, quieter, more respectful, as if they understood that what they were witnessing was not spectacle but something far more rare, something that could not be reduced to conversation later, because it had already altered the way they saw everything in front of them, and Jason finally moved again, not forward in dominance, not backward in avoidance, but with a measured step that placed him closer to where he needed to stand, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the authority it once had, only sincerity, only presence. "I see them," he said, the word simple, but different now, because they were not just spoken, they were meant, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, long enough to understand that something had changed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to matter, and she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, not granting anything, not forgiving anything, simply recognizing that the truth had been received, and that was enough, and the children remained still beside her, their quiet presence unchanged, because for them, this was not a moment of revelation, it was simply a continuation of what had always been true, and as the silence settled again, softer now, more grounded, the entire room seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in acceptance, because the story they had expected to witness had already ended, and something else, something quieter and far more meaningful, had taken its place, and standing there, no longer at the center but finally within the reality he had once ignored, Jason understood that this moment was not about reclaiming anything from the past, it was about deciding what he would do with the truth that now stood clearly in front of him, and for the first time, that decision did not feel like power. It felt like responsibility. Nothing rushed the moment forward, not the efficient, not the music, not even the expectation of what a wedding should be, because what remained in the room now was something quieter and far more defining, a shift that could not be undone simply by continuing as planned, and Emily felt it settle fully, not as tension, but as resolution, the kind that does not require applause or acknowledgement, only acceptance, and she looked at Jason one last time, not searching for anything in his expression, not waiting for a response that might change what had already been revealed, but simply recognizing that the distance between who they had been and who they were now had finally been made visible, and it no longer needed to be explained, and the children beside her remained calm, their presence unchanged, because for them, nothing had been revealed, nothing had shifted, this was simply their reality existing in a space where others were only now beginning to understand it, and Emily's hand rested lightly against one small shoulder. Again, a quiet, grounding gesture that spoke of everything she had built without needing to name it, and she took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but as a marker, a gentle closing of the moment she had come to create, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying easily through the room without force. That is all, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than any dramatic exit ever could, because it made clear that she had not come to take anything, not to disrupt, not to reclaim, but to allow what was real to stand where it could no longer be ignored, and Jason heard it, understood it in a way that did not require explanation, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret, only something to carry forward, and he did not move immediately, did not reach for her, did not try to stop her, because somewhere within him, he understood that this was not a moment he could hold on to, it was one he had to let exist as it was, complete and unaltered, and Chloe stood still behind him, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet stillness of her own, as if she too had recognized that the moment did not belong to her, that it had never been about comparison or victory, but about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with her at all, and the guests remained silent, not out of discomfort now, but out of respect, because they understood, even if only partially, that what they had witnessed was not something to be interrupted or reacted to, it was something to be acknowledged in its own quiet gravity, and Emily turned then, not abruptly, not with finality, but with the same calm presence she had carried from the moment she arrived, and the children moved with her naturally, instinctively, their small steps in quiet sync as they followed her lead without question, because their world had always been built around that steady guidance, and as they began to walk back toward the doors, the room did not break into conversation, did not rush to fill the silence with noise, it remained still, held in the aftermath of something that had changed it in ways that could not be easily undone, and Jason watched them go, not with the certainty he had carried before, but with something new, something quieter, something unresolved but real, and for the first time, he did not try to define what he was feeling, he simply allowed it to exist, and as the doors opened once more and the light from outside touched the floor again, it felt different now, not as an entrance, but as a continuation, something beyond the space he had controlled, something that no longer revolved around him, and as Emily stepped through without looking back, it became clear that what she had left behind was not chaos, not disruption, but something far more powerful, a truth that would remain long after the moment had passed, shaping what came next in ways no one in the room could fully predict. The doors closed softly behind her, and the sound, though quiet, carried farther than anything else that had happened that day, because it marked an ending no one had expected and a beginning no one could yet define, and inside the chapel, no one moved to stop her, no one called her name, because something in the air had changed too deeply for interruption, and Jason remained where he was, standing at the front of a ceremony that no longer felt like his gaze fixed on the space where she had just been, as if trying to hold onto something that had already passed beyond his reach, and for the first time, the silence around him was not empty, it was full, filled with everything he had not seen, everything he had not asked, everything that had existed without him and would continue to exist long after this moment ended, and he could feel it now, not as a loss, but as a truth, steady and undeniable, and the weight of it did not crush him, it settled into him, reshaping something deeper than pride, something closer to understanding. And Chloe stood a few steps away, no longer beside him, her posture composed but distant, her expression thoughtful rather than reactive, because even she could feel that what had just happened was not something that could be undone or ignored, it had shifted the ground beneath them all, and the guests, once gathered for celebration, now stood quietly, their earlier energy replaced by something more reflective, more aware, as if they too had been pulled into a moment that demanded more than observation, demanded recognition. And no one rushed to fill the silence, no one reached for music or movement to restore what had been planned, because what had been planned no longer held meaning in the same way, and Jason finally exhaled, slowly, deliberately, as if releasing something he had been holding onto for years without realizing it, and when he lifted his head again, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to show that he was no longer standing in the same place he had been before she walked through those doors, and he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but simply seeing, really seeing, the people, the space, the moment as it was, without the filter he had always relied on, and it felt different, quieter, more honest, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to control what came next. He only felt the need to face it, and outside, beyond the chapel walls, the world continued without pause, the sunlight stretching across the pavement, the black limousine waiting just long enough before pulling away, carrying with it a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard, a woman who had not come for revenge, but for something far more powerful, something lasting, something that did not rely on anyone else to exist. And inside, Jason stood still for a moment longer, letting the truth settle completely, not resisting it, not reshaping it, simply accepting that the story he had believed was complete had never truly been finished. And now, as the room slowly began to breathe again, he understood something he had never understood before, that some endings are not loud, not dramatic, not defined by confrontation, but by clarity, by the quiet realization that what truly matters does not disappear when ignored. It waits, it grows, it becomes undeniable, and when it finally stands in front of you, it does not ask for recognition, it simply exists, and in that existence, everything changes. And as Jason took his first step away from the altar, not toward the past, not toward what he had planned, but toward something uncertain and real, the only truth that remained was this: she had never needed to return to prove anything. She had already become everything he once believed she could not be, and that was something he would carry long after the room had emptied and the day had ended.